Hello and welcome to Journeys and Journals. I'm Bernie Martin Beck, and I meet the most fascinating people who live in Southern Oregon and Northern California, and we learn their stories. And today my guest has come all the way from Medford and much farther to bring us this story. I want you to welcome Betty Henshaw.
Thank
I left
you.
one out. Betty
Grant Henshaw.
Now, Grant is obviously the name you were born to. Huh?
Grant is my maiden name, and the story is my family story.
And that's this book, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But what brings you to Southern Oregon?
I've lived in Southern Oregon since 1956.
Well, that's almost a native.
Right, that's really a native Oregonian almost. Well, I have spent most of my life in Oregon, but I grew up in the Oklahoma Hills during the Dust Bowl. I was born during the Dust Bowl.
So you know what that really means. Anytime we see it on TV, we have to kind of think about
yes,
powdery.
Well, on the prairie, you know, they got those black clouds that just blocked out the sun. And it didn't rain enough for 5 years to raise a crop. We did live in the Oklahoma Hills, but we were probably 250 miles from the prairie, but the dust drifted everywhere. And we got a lot of dust. My dad told me the story about, well, it hadn't rained and it was so hot. His corn crop dried up, died, and then the winds whipped the stalks. He said that whipped them off at the ground and blew the whole crop out of the field. Oh. That was the first year. So the second year they didn't buy seed. Instead, he went to work for the WPA. And my dad's old WPA card is actually copied in here.
Oh,
that was probably 1934 or 35.
You know, the story is probably real familiar to a lot of people who came to California and Oregon, Washington, to find a better life.
I meet a lot of people who relate to the book.
And the book is this, Children of the Dust. And then it has a little subtitle here, and I just have to laugh about this one, The Okie Family Story.
Right.
But you're no longer, well, you're sort of Okie.
I was 15, almost 15 when we left there.
And you've been a resident here in Southern Oregon?
I graduated from high school in California. We moved to the San Joaquin Valley and worked in the fields. And there was we couldn't find a house, so we lived with my aunt for a month and then moved into a Mitchell's labor camp on the outskirts of Corcoran. And I graduated from high school while we were still living in the camp.
So then Corcoran is kind of home. I mean,
Corcoran is home. Yeah.
And so it's a farming community, and the dust and the drought had not reached California.
And they had irrigation too. They had, for a number of years, they had irrigation.
Well, that really is the difference, because when we went back to South Dakota, my husband says you'll see it's dry and dusty and it's miserable. We left there in a hurry and never looked back.
They have to depend on the rain, or they did then.
Right, and now there's rainbirds and pumps and irrigations and
all through there too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why don't you tell us just a little bit about you and how in the world does now you're one of these farmers, one of these little girls, family of how many?
3 boys and 6 girls, and one girl, the first baby died at 5 months old.
Oh my.
So there were 10 of us, but there were 9 of us lived. There were 9 of us in the pickup truck on Route 66 with my mom and dad when we moved from Oklahoma to California. There were 9 of us.
Now, you said Route 66.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to drive on that just about a mile. I mean, there's freeways around bypassing it.
Yeah.
But what was that like for you?
Route 66 was actually, it was the Mother Road. You probably know. It was our first interstate highway across the country from Chicago to Santa Monica, California. And so it was like, Claremore, Route 66 went right through Claremore, and that's where we lived the last years that we were in Oklahoma. So we only had to go about 6 miles and hit Route 66, and it took us all the way to Barstow, California. And my dad was scared to death because he'd never driven any more than into Claremore, which was 6 miles.
Your dad had this pickup, and he'd driven 6 miles back and forth.
Right.
That was it.
That was it.
And he had a dream, go west, young man, or whatever it was.
He wanted to go, but he was scared. My mother was excited about going. And all those years I was growing up, I tell the story of how the crops would be gathered in and Daddy'd decide, no, I think I'll stay and farm one more year. And my mom, I don't know how she kept from giving up, but she didn't. And my mother's dreams became my own. I was anxious to move to California. So when we finally left, it was an adventure and it was an excitement. And then we land in this, San Joaquin Valley. We did cotton one day. It was 116 degrees. I was about 17. But at noon, the man who was running the crew sent us home at noon because it was too hot. My dad was driving a tractor further out in the lake basin, and he didn't know we'd gone home. And he worried about us all day, that we had gone home at noon. But we worked, that's the work in the fields, and sticking together as a family, working hard to get out of the camp. For 2 years, Daddy said he was going to go back to Oklahoma and get a small farm. And I think my dad actually grieved
Over leaving
home. And I think it took him 2 years to get over his grief and finally realize he made the right move. And he did buy a house, and that we got out of the camp.
What's a camp?
Labor camp.
I don't know what that means.
See, so many people don't. So many people don't know what the labor camps were like. Most of them were one-room cabins, just rows of one-room cabins, and whole families lived in those cabins. There was in the middle of the camp was a community shower and toilet. And of course, my mom, it was the camp, the middle of the shower like that was kind of off limits for us girls, unless Mom went with us. She'd go with us out to take a shower, and we, but we actually, when Daddy heard about, it was an old 3-room house, 1 bedroom. It had been brought in and just kind of plunked down in the sand with no foundation. They'd hauled it in and made it a part of the camp so they'd have something else to rent. And we moved into that old house.
Now, that one didn't have a bathroom either.
No. No, we had an outhouse out back. And then the community shower in the middle of the camp was, and toilet was for us to use.
So I'm guessing there'd be long lines. How many people in a camp? What's it like?
That particular camp was more like a horseshoe. The cabins went like that. And then the street was out here. And I don't know how many cabins there were, but there were bigger camps. Some of the camps would have just a row here and a row there and a row there, you know.
And did you ever go to other camps, or you just stayed in this?
We stayed right there in that camp.
Because hop pickers here in Southern Oregon they'd pick hops, and then they'd go over to Klamath and pick potatoes. Mm-hmm. And they went over to Medford and picked pears and apples. Mm-hmm. And
a lot of people did that there. We had schoolmates that They'd be there through cotton picking season, and then they'd go on to pick oranges, or maybe they'd go to pick beans, you know, in Oregon. And every fall they would come back, like for 4 or 5 years before the mechanical pickers took over. They would come back and enroll in school again. And their parents would pick cotton. And
now, did you get to go to school?
Oh, yeah. My dad was determined we'd go to school.
Now, what kind of education did Dad and Mom have?
Daddy had to drop out when he was in the 5th grade, very disappointed. He loved school. He loved learning. My mom was in the 7th grade when she had to drop out.
Now, do we have pictures of Mom and Dad here in the book?
Yes, and the stories of my dad had always been so hurt because he had to drop out of school. He was determined from the very beginning that we go to school. And he kept us in school.
Well, there's Dad and Mom, huh?
That's Mom and Dad in 1943, I think. Maybe 40.
And all you kids?
That's Mom and all of us, but Robert, the oldest one. And Kitty, my youngest sister, is there, and Jim is not yet born. 2 years later, Jim comes along.
The family.
Yeah.
You said that you live in Southern Oregon.
Mm-hmm.
And is that the genesis of this book? You learned about...
When I moved here in '56, I was about 30 years old when I took a class over at the high school from a freelance writer, and he was from Ashland. And the second night of the class, I became really discouraged over an essay that I had written. It was, actually it was in the early 70s, and I wrote an essay about a black girl that I had gone to school with, and she wasn't excited about graduating because she couldn't get a job, and she told me her story, and it kind of opened my eyes, you know. I hadn't thought that I could go to work at the bank or I could go to work at one of the stores, but they wouldn't take her application. She had to go back out and pick cotton. Well, I was going back out to pick cotton. I didn't know what I was going to do for sure. But
now you're talking Medford, Oregon? Or the story is from where?
oh yeah, I was taking the class and I wrote the story about her. And
so she lived in California?
yeah, but
Okay.
the instructor, I'm sorry, the instructor in Medford didn't like my story. He said we had heard enough. And it wasn't the 60s anymore. And
But it was the 70s.
yeah.
Okay.
But he thought we had heard enough. And so I went home that night very discouraged. So, but after my husband died here in Medford, I decided to try again and write my story.
And his name is?
Ransom Henshaw.
Ransom.
Ransom.
What a name. Where did he get that one?
I don't know, actually. The only place I've ever heard it before was in one of Robert Louis Stevenson's books. I think Kidnapped. There was a character, and it was like that family to pick that character out of the book. I don't know.
And you and Ransom had how many children?
No, I didn't have children.
Uh-huh.
No, I was 51 when I married Ransom.
Oh. And when he passed away, you said, I've got stories in my head.
Yes, and I was actually too young to retire. I was 56, and so I decided I was going to try, see what I could do. And I took some classes. I got with a really good writing group, and I collected stories, and I eventually made a outline and got the stories all together. And one day I looked at this, and I think I have a book here.
These were just stories of your family, and you wanted to share them with your nieces and nephews?
Right, and I had them inside me for so long. When I finally started writing, they just flowed out. It was just like a dam bursting. I just had story after story after story.
Why don't you read one of your favorites to us and just let us get a glimmer of, this is called Children of the Dust Bowl. And And now you do public readings of this?
I do. I've done readings quite a lot, and I promoted it quite a bit in California last year. I'll read this little bit here.
Oh, the pictures are worth 1,000 words here. Oh, Uncle Ed and Aunt Jessie.
Uncle Ed and Aunt Jane. Yeah.
Oh, Aunt Jane.
Jane, yeah.
Oh, they just look priceless. I mean, they've got a nice car for. Now they're the ones.
She was baptized. She was baptized with us.
What's the baptism story?
Let me see if I can find that one. I wasn't sure if I was going to be reading, so I usually.
Well, you can just tell us that yarn. It sounds.
I'd like to read the first page and then I'll go on. Is that okay?
You bet.
I don't remember when it began, but as far back as my mind can reach, Mom and Daddy talked about leaving the farm in Oklahoma and moving to California. Each season, as the crops were gathered in, Mama's dreams were shattered as Daddy decided to stay and farm one more year. I was still a toddler at the onset of a stretch of dry years that turned the Oklahoma prairie into a dust bowl, so I don't remember the first wave of migrants heading west, looking for a better life. That was when two of Daddy's sisters and their families left us for California. Once Aunt Addie's family settled into their new life, she sent letters and postcards from California that created excitement in our house. Mama read them to us and showed us pictures of pink and white oleander bushes and bright bougainvillea vines trailing the walls and fences. To me, the most exciting thing was the rock rising out of the ocean at Morro Bay and a note on the back saying it took us 45 minutes to climb to the top and back. That was my Aunt Addie's son.
Now, you are in the flat, Oklahoma, and the thought of a rock big enough to climb in 45 minutes must have been awesome. Yeah. And the ocean around it.
Yeah, she sent the picture, and I still have that picture and the writing on the back. And yeah.
Good for you. Well, I love your writing style.
Thank you.
It makes me feel like I was right there with you.
Thank you. I hope so.
And you can, now the dust, can you feel the way it was almost stifling you? What was it like?
I was really pretty small at that time. My mom and dad talked about wearing handkerchiefs over their faces. And Mom said the dust came in through every little crack in the door, floor, around the windows, got in the food. So as far as like on the prairie where the cattle died and sometimes the dust drifted in and just covered up even farm machinery. But we were further away than that, and we got a lot of dust, but it drifted. I think that it must have affected about 5 different states.
Oh, yes, and those people couldn't breathe, couldn't eat, couldn't definitely grow crops.
No.
And it was devastating for the whole country.
We had chickens and a small garden, if you could carry enough water to get to the garden.
How'd you get the water? Where'd you get the water from?
From the well. We had a well.
This kind?
Yeah, yeah. Pulled with a rope, let the bucket down in, and then pulled it up with a rope.
And carried it to the garden.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, my.
And then, like I said, Daddy went to work on the WPA.
Doing what?
On the roads, building roads.
Okay, now is that?
That's the Public Works division or department that President Roosevelt started.
And so he had a little cash, finally.
Yeah. I actually think that I personally think that program saved a lot of people. I know it did my parents. And
did you get food commodities and things like that?
Not until after we moved to California, but we were there in the valley, and there was a couple of winters when Daddy, I tell a story about him bringing the powdered milk and powdered eggs and sitting them on the table. We'd never seen such things. We raised chickens, and
oh.
But we did get help in the winter when there was no work, we did get commodities in California.
And look at us now. As I said to our Canadian cousins, I said, we now all have shoes and socks on, and you know, we came to Canada from Ireland. They just wanted to get the people off the land, and the family came with nothing.
Yeah.
They paid, except the child that died on the way was Robert Kalbick. You know, it must have taken their last penny to bury the fella, and just a little kid.
Yeah.
Your story is so moving. Now, Mom and Dad had another child, their firstborn.
She died, they had moved to Texas the year they married, and Daddy worked in the oil fields at Borger, Texas. And there was an epidemic of encephalitis. And she died. There was a lot of children died with that year. So when they went back to Oklahoma, they were suffering the loss of a little girl. But then they had 9 more.
Oh, you've got so many lovely stories, but why don't you share, turn to the page of your favorite story and read for a minute or two of how you saw this and how it played out in your life in those days and now here in Rogue Valley.
I wish I had marked them. I can find them, but it takes me just a minute.
Oh. Well, I'll show you a few pictures because this is...
Oh, you're thinking about Uncle Ed and Aunt Jane?
Yeah, we've got them in. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, you know, your courage is great. Your idea to put this down honestly and truthfully and let us walk those dusty roads with you is wonderful.
I lived it all over again. And I outlined it. My earliest memories are when we left Hominy, where we had lived in a log cabin on my Uncle Ari's place. When we left Hominy, then we moved to Wagner, and when we left Wagner, we moved near Muskogee, and all those, I outlined them according, because Daddy was a sharecropper, or tenant farmer, and he was always looking for a better place, so where he could raise a good crop of cotton, because it was a cash crop.
Oh.
And
the pictures of cotton in here, there
in
probably
Oklahoma,
wasn't a pound of cotton on 10 bushes. Where's your book available? I need to ask that.
You can get it at Barnes & Noble, Borders, Pals in Portland has it, Amazon.com. And it's now out in paperback. You have the hardcover.
I sure do.
And it was a finalist for the Oklahoma Book of the Year Award in '07.
Now, why wasn't it a California Book of the Year?
My home wasn't in California anymore.
Even though the book's so part about California.
An awful lot of it is about California.
Because that's where you were growing up. You went to school, graduated from that. Which story do you want to share with us?
I'm on Route 66.
Yeah.
It's a little further over here, but
we can all kind of hum along a few bars of Route 66 or the TV program. Look at these folks, aren't they just duded up? Too good to be true. And
this is the vines my mom raised.
And Mom must have sewed all the time.
She
did.
Have
a machine?
She did. I have her old sewing machine now, and it still sews. It's an old treadle machine.
Treadle.
Yes, but this is a story of when we were on Route 66. I was sitting on a bench in the back of the pickup, looking out across the vast Arizona desert, when I heard a rattle underneath the truck, and we coasted off onto a narrow shoulder of the road. Mama, Daddy, and Robert walked to the back. of the truck, and Robert lifted Kitty into the back with me. She stood wide-eyed and clung to the tailgate. I started to climb out when Daddy said, "Stay where you are. We're parked too close to the road." Then he told Robert to get behind the wheel while he rolled the pickup off of the pavement. "What do you reckon it is, Daddy?" Mama's voice quivered. "I don't have any ID," he said.
ID?
Yeah. He laid on the ground and looked under the truck, but Daddy was no mechanic. He got up and said he'd have to go for help. Mama was beside herself. "There's no telling how far you'll have to walk. Someday, somebody will pick me up. Look at that road, Daddy. There ain't a car in sight." "I'll go with him," Robert said. "No, you won't," Daddy told him. "You stay here with Mom and the kids. We can't both go off and leave them." Daddy, what if you don't get a ride?" Mama pleaded. "How long am I supposed to wait here? Something could happen to you." My mom was a chronic worrier.
I get the picture. So what happened? I guess you'll just have to tell us the end of that story.
Well, he did get a ride.
Oh,
and I never forgot him. He had walked quite a ways, but I never forgot how he climbed up into the back of the pickup that stopped to pick him up, and he was hanging on to the cab of the pickup, took his old Stetson hat off, and waved it to us, you know.
Oh. Now,
smile on his face.
Now, when you would talk riding in the pickup, your suitcases were in there too, right?
What few clothes we had were just not very much.
Well, I think the story...
We left a lot behind, and I tell in here how we sacrificed by just leaving things we would like to have taken, but there were so many of us, and for us to be comfortable, we had to leave a lot behind.
That's like the Pioneer covered wagons. That if it
didn't have room for much.
Didn't have room. Thank you, Betty. Thank you so much for being my guest.
It's been fun.
I'm looking forward to learning more from your book, because this is history, folks. It's what brought us out west to a better life, and Oregon and California have certainly been a blessing to my family too. I'm Bernie Martin Beck saying thanks so very much for tuning in. And thanks again, Betty, for being my guest.
Thank you for having me.